Okay, thanks, Cameron, and hello, everybody. Welcome to our afternoon webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about cannabinoids and some of the uh, issues and opportunities that surround that, predominantly for thinking about consumer product goods applications. So on behalf of the whole RTI Innovation Advisors team, I want to thank you for making time to join us this afternoon. And we hope that you find the information useful and informative as you weigh decisions that you and your organization are making about how to move forward with CBD and other cannabinoid related products. Before we dive in, let me say just a quick word about RTI Innovation Advisors and the team that's bringing you this presentation today. We are a mission-driven innovation consultancy because we're part of a mission-driven research institute called RTI International. And in our work, we focus on three related innovation challenges that many organizations face. In our strategy work, we help bring improved methodologies to strategic planning processes so that organizations can start to look further out on the horizon, plan for more complex futures, and find their way to the upside of those futures. In our insights work, we work with innovation and new product development teams, and we bring the world of the possible to those teams. We bring insights on emerging technologies, emerging growth opportunities, potential partners to join forces with, to bring some of their innovative ideas to the marketplace. And then in our go-to-market work, we work with early stage technology developers. These are predominantly universities and federal agencies who are very skilled at moving from basic to applied science and having some breakthroughs in that work. We help connect that expertise to potential partners and find the right pathway to the market for their early stage technologies. So this is where we live. These are the organization issues that we work on, and we'd love to explore opportunities to do the same with you as your needs arise. Certainly, I think the opportunity and the complexity around cannabinoids is a perfect example of where we dive in when there's many faceted aspects to the issue to be explored: technology, regulatory, competitiveness, supply chains and partners. These are thorny issues that we're well positioned to help organizations see their way through and find the right opportunities. So again, glad to have you with us today. Let me turn things over to my colleague, Dr. Lawrence Blume, who will walk you through the materials that we have in our presentation today. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. Jeff, thanks for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be able to present some of the insights and some of the work that we see in this space. I've quickly put up today's agenda, and what you'll see is we'll be covering a little bit about kind of market and consumer opportunity. I know a lot of you on the line are very familiar with the prevalence of CBD in the marketplace across a number of product categories. We're going to take a little bit of a deeper insight there and show you where we see some trends and potential opportunities. And then we'll really kind of move into the heart of some of our work and experience in the space. And that's looking at CBD as an active and topical products. We've looked at CBD and other cannabinoids from an ingestion standpoint. So those would be edibles and food and beverages in great detail. We're not going to discuss that today unless there's some relevant pieces of information, which there are in the back as we look at potential safety issues. We're mostly going to focus on topical applications. And then we'll wrap up looking at safety considerations and kind of a summary of how to approach this space. What we'll do is we want to make this interactive. And so instead of holding questions, Q&A at the end, what we decided to do is at the end of each of these topic areas, we'll pause for a brief moment. Jeff will read a couple of the questions that come through if some questions do arise. I'll take a couple of moments to answer some of those, and then we'll move into the next section. And then hopefully at the end, there's still a few minutes to answer any outstanding questions or things that we are unable to get to before. Okay, with that being said, before we jump into this, I just wanted to take a brief moment and just kind of orient everyone to RTI International as a whole. And the reason that I'm doing this, and really the reason for today's seminar, is that we've been working in the space for over 40 years from a social and laboratory perspective. That's RTI International as a whole. Our advisory group has been doing a lot of work with CPG, life science, and food and beverage companies as well in this space. And what we're consistently seeing out there is an overwhelming amount of information as it relates to kind of the science, the claims, the product development of cannabinoid, products, CBD products. And, there's a lot of, uncertainty, and there's a lot of bias in that information. So as a research-driven nonprofit research organization, our goal is to turn that science and practice into knowledge that helps improve the human condition. So we think we are, essentially serving as stewards of the science to the space. And I serve on a number of scientific advisory boards related to this, helping different groups think about, what are the true potential benefits, as well as what are the real risk and, harmful implications of using CBD and other cannabinoids in a variety of products. And so that's some of the insights that I want to share with you today. So from a marketing perspective, and really from a consumer perspective, we're well aware that CBD is kind of the media darling as we have it, and you see it across product categories: edibles, personal care, pet food. You see it in cosmetics. You see it in textiles. So there's a high awareness among consumers regarding CBD. Roughly 20% of adults have used CBD in the past 6 months. In the US, that's just over 40 million consumers. So most of the people out there are aware of it, and about a fifth of them have tried it. In terms of the retail opportunities, last year there were over 10,000 SKUs for CBD infused products, or products using CBD. So out of those products, where we see a lot of interest and where a lot of the studies, BDS Analytics, the Brightfield Group, they've put out some really good data over the last year. You'll see infused foods is a key category. Vitamins and nutritionals is another category. And then skincare, health and beauty in the skincare space is another emerging one. So when you look at that and you think about the health and wellness opportunity, because that's really where we're seeing the change in consumers. So the previous demographic in general of someone who would want to consume or use cannabinoids is not the same as what we're seeing today demographically. So there's a shift, and we'll talk about that shift in just a moment. So almost 3/4 of consumers do believe that CBD products offer some type of health and wellness benefit. The science is still out there, and we'll discuss that in just a little bit. And regardless of age group, that sentiment really holds true. In terms of where consumers see the greatest perceived benefit, that would be in pain management, stress, and essentially relaxation strategies. Obviously, during the times that we live in right now, there's a huge demand for looking at aids, different types of natural aids that can help release stress and relaxation. And there's been a large influx of new consumers to the market looking at CBD for those potential properties. Healthy skin and sleep are some of the other main categories that consumers are looking to. From a brand perspective, brand integrity is growingly important to consumers. Before, consumers were brand agnostic. However, that's really beginning to change, and part of that's related to the trustworthiness and the transparency of those brands. And so we see organizations that are able to be innovative, provide products that actually deliver on what they say they will do, really will have a step up in the competition. So just to look at this from a slightly different perspective, the growth drivers in the marketplace right now is the awareness. Part of that awareness has come from large chain retailers entering the space, CVS, Walgreens, a number of other stores and groups of that nature, as well as the availability. Passing of the Farm Hemp Bill has allowed CBD use in topicals. However, there's a whole nother discussion that we would need to have around the regulation, both from the federal and state, as it relates to the use of CBD in both topicals and other product categories. We'll briefly touch on that, but that's a webinar in and of itself. So there's this big desire as well for natural alternatives to pharmaceuticals. And that's part of the reason that we're seeing a shift in some of the demographics. So within the leading categories, edibles right now, baked goods, gummies, and other sources of food make up the largest segment. Topicals and cosmetics are quickly behind that space. And then when you look at the fastest growing categories, it's beauty and skincare, as well as capsules, which is related to the nutritional, and drinks. And drinks are really becoming quite popular. So if you look at the sale of CBD skincare products, it's one of the focuses of this particular webinar, looking at the topical space. They were 17 million in 2018, and last year they were just over $3 million. So a significant growth in the sales of those products. So who's using them? Well, as I mentioned, the shift in demographics, there's a lot more women, there's a lot more parents, and there's a large number of millennials that are avid users and consistent users of these products. And it's to treat some of the common indications. I will say the common indications are for treatment of anxiety, pain, depression, inflammation, and insomnia or sleep. And then we're seeing a kind of a surge in new products entering the marketplace as it relates to acne, anti-aging, and moisturizing. So consumers as a whole tend to understand, or generally understand, the difference between CBD and THC. And the discriminating factor in that is that they know that THC is the compound that's going to give you the high, the psychotropic experience, and then CBD does not have that effect. It has activity in the brain, but it doesn't produce the high that's typically associated with cannabis consumption or marijuana consumption. But there's an incredible amount of education that companies and groups need to do in terms of product development and how they communicate with consumers. And that's really what kind of the next two images on this slide talk to. Consumers struggle, for the most part, to clearly define the difference between marijuana and hemp. Those of us that have worked in the space understand that from a legal definition, hemp is defined as having less than or equal to 0.3% THC in the dried matter. They're both marijuana and hemp are part of the cannabis plant. They have a lot of the same bioactives. It's really the THC concentration. You take that a step further, and that's where things really become a little bit more complicated. And you start looking at the different types of extracts that are on the marketplace and things that you'll see on products. You see full spectrum. Full spectrum essentially is everything that you find, the waxes, different types of bioactives. Broad spectrum is where it's been refined. The majority of those waxes have been removed. Most of the THC, to a great extent, has been removed. And so broad spectrum is mainly CBD, potentially some other bioactives, depending on the refinement process, and terpenes. And we'll talk about terpenes in just a second. And then an isolate is going to be a more purified product, anywhere from 90 to 95% CBD. Now, different groups claim that a full spectrum versus a broad spectrum versus an isolate, that each of those has its advantages and disadvantages, and I would tend to agree with that. But you really need to look at it from a very specific use application and not just broadly. And that kind of translates to this term called the entourage effect. Many of you are probably familiar or at least heard it. And some groups will claim that that's, the core reason that CBD and other cannabinoids are able to produce some of these benefits is because you need the terpenes, you need some of these bioactives, some which we know of, others which we probably don't know of. And it's, varying ratios of those that ultimately lead to the desired effects. Where the science comes into is actually trying to analyze what are those different bioactives and how do they relate to a specific treatment or indication. And that research is really not there for the vast majority of the common ailments that CBD and other cannabinoid products are trying to treat. From a business perspective, the value chain is highly complicated. Most of the challenges are associated around unclear regulations and a lack of standardization practices. So if you everywhere from cultivation to final product development and labeling, there are different rules and regulations that need to be considered. The DEA can potentially play a role in some of these areas, but for most of the space, it's going to be the FDA who's going to be looking out for claims, and then it's going to be the FTC who's going to have a similar role, looking out for claims, but a little bit more weight in terms of what they can do. What we see is that there's an enormous amount of need to come up with standardization practices in terms of purity identification, the testing of products, the labeling of products, and the transparency in the way that which kind of all of these things come together. It's not there. There's a lot of groups that are working on that, but there's a lot more that needs to be done for this space really to continue forward and to be successful moving forward. So when you look at the consumer and business, kind of components together, there's some common, topics as well as some common concerns that both groups have. So from a consumer side, they're very curious about topicals and edibles and CBD and cannabinoids in general, but there's some real concerns about, are they effective? What's the product quality, the safety, and then access to youth. From a business perspective, CBD offers a novel path for products and growth. And, from both sides of the table, it's really trust and transparency that's critical. So there needs to be more education, and there really needs to be more listening among groups and other agencies, both at the state, the federal, and the commercial level. So Jeff, I'm going to pause there. I'm not sure if any questions came in before we go into the the topical space.
None yet. So, but let's put the call out there to the group. If you have a question that you want to ask about the content we've walked through so far, use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and you can submit your questions there. And feel free to do that throughout the course of the presentation, and we'll stop along the way at various times to answer those questions.
Okay, so if nothing's come through, let's jump into the next section. And my guess is there might be some more questions here.
Actually, one just came in. So before we go. So Kathy says one of the concerns that she hears about is consumers don't believe CBD really works. Are you hearing this, and what is being done to clarify those concerns?
Yeah, it's a really great question. Yes, a lot of I don't know what the exact percentage is, but I'm also hearing that consumers are skeptical about the implications of CBD to alleviate different types of ailments that the human body may experience. Most of the research to date is anecdotal and hasn't been done in large clinical studies outside of a few, and so there's real concern there. But I also would say that anecdotal evidence holds a lot of weight. When I first entered the cannabinoid research space back in the early 2000s, a lot of the conferences I attended, we had medical doctors promoting how CBD and other cannabinoids could help in, reduce pain, how they could help reduce nausea, and a couple of other indications. But ultimately, we didn't know the exact mechanisms, but as a scientific field, when we reflect back, a lot of that data was very useful and turned out to be true from a therapy standpoint.
Great. All right. Thanks, Lawrence. Yeah, let's keep rolling and yeah, keep those questions coming. We'll address them as they between now and the next pause.
Okay, great. So the meat of today is really looking at CBD as a topical active. And in order to do that, there's a couple of things that we need to explore. We're going to explore the endocannabinoid system, at least ground ourselves on the principles and the key components of the system, and then take a little bit more of a detailed look of what CBD has been proposed to do in terms of, kind of mechanism of action through the skin and on the body. And then take a final look at how that relates to potential products and formulation and some challenges associated with that. So as I mentioned earlier, there's just a wide array of products in the marketplace. This is just an example of 4. So you see balms, you see different types of lotions and creams, you see potential use as an antibiotic. They come in a variety of formats. So lotions and creams are the most popular, but there's also roll-ons. There's oils and serums that are also being developed. There's patches, for transdermal patches are also, an option that some groups are looking at. And there's even CBD infused fabrics. This is a newer group that actually encapsulates CBD into the layers of the fabric. And the idea here is that if CBD is beneficial for reducing inflammation, if you put this in sports clothing, CBD would be released as your body rubs against that fabric and essentially provide, temporary relief of any inflammation or pain that may occur. So it's definitely an interesting concept. So what this really results in, and Kathy, to your question, there is over 100 different claims that are out there in the marketplace. This word cloud just pulls in, I think we looked at 200 products, maybe slightly more across categories, and this just pulls in the most common kind of terms and claims that are associated with that. To the right, you're seeing a slightly more specific breakdown of product claims and general categories where we see groups promoting the use of CBD from a beneficial standpoint. I've highlighted certain ones because they relate to today's topical. So treatment of acne, moisturizing, treatment of acute pain, anti-inflammatory, anti-aging, and then just general disease prevention. As a scientist, when I look at this, and probably even as a consumer, I'm thinking, how can one compound produce all of these different therapeutic effects? That just doesn't seem feasible to me. And so moving forward, as the science continues to build in the space, I will bet that a number of these claims, potential claims, quickly drop off the radar. And some of them will stay and actually be substantiated through clinical trials and through more human-defined studies. But right now, there's a lot out there, and so sorting through that can be relatively challenging. Now, not all groups, to be honest, are really concerned about sorting through the science. They're in the marketplace to make as much revenue as they can in hopes that they potentially get acquired, and or kind of ride this out into some of the much larger companies, in theory, come into this space and reduce their market share or run them out of business. However, the groups that we see being most successful moving forward, and the ones that we've been working with, are really looking at the science and really trying to understand how the endocannabinoid system works so that they can actually go after reliable claims, and they can support the efficacy of their product. And that's really where the innovation and true opportunity lies, as you move forward, specifically as it deals with health and wellness and potential therapeutic applications. So this is a quick overview of the endocannabinoid system. So our bodies make our own endogenous molecules that are very similar. Well, THC and CBD are very similar to the molecules that our body makes, and those are called endocannabinoids. So the endocannabinoid system is a lipid mediating system, and it has a very long evolutionary history. And so some of these early molecules and receptors and some of the enzymes that produce and break down these molecules arrived on scene before Homo sapiens, before our species did. And so there's some really interesting work that's starting to come out. And what that work talks about is as humans evolved, some research suggests that the eating of cannabinoid foods, so eating of foods that had cannabinoid-like molecules, actually influenced our body's own endocannabinoid system and made it what it is today, and ultimately why it has such a diverse array of function. But whether that actually plays out to be true, it's a very interesting hypothesis and approach to the field. There's one key thing that I want everyone to take away from this is, yes, the endocannabinoid system, our body's internal system, is very important in a number of key physiological factors. But one of the most important criteria, at least when it comes to product development and thinking about giving exogenous cannabinoids, is we each have our own internal tone. So it's very similar to a metabolic resting rate, where you need a certain amount of calories to maintain your body mass and your daily functioning. You go over those calories, you tend to put on weight, and you have other implications. You go under them, and a whole host of other things happen. That's very similar with the endocannabinoid system. There's a constitutive or endogenous tone, and some people have a higher tone, which in theory could relate to certain issues or abnormalities or diseases, and others have a low basal tone, which could have another host of factors. So what that means is not every person's going to respond the same to the products that they're taking. If you already have a high tone, you might not need more. You actually might need less, and vice versa. So that really gets into demographics and really understanding the etiology of potential treatments for CBD and other cannabinoids, and how you tie that together. So as I mentioned, there's a number of signaling pathways. Right now in the literature, there's over 60 different mechanisms. So MOA is mechanism of action. I'm sorry, I should have spelled that out, but it's a really complex picture. So we're only beginning to understand all of the different targets that CBD can affect, as well as how some of these, the other cannabinoids and phytocannabinoids have effects. And so there's synergies, there's antagonistic effects, and ultimately you could think about different properties or different ratios. CBD and THC, which is currently used as a spray, improves a lot of benefits from a medical standpoint. So we're only beginning to learn the true capabilities of CBD in terms of regulating some of these indications. But I think there's a lot of optimism, and I'm personally excited to see which ones stay on the radar and which ones potentially fall off the radar as we learn more. So specifically related to today's conversation, I just wanted to highlight a little bit further the role that the endocannabinoid system plays in skin health. And so from when you're looking at non-ingestible products and CPG products that are predominantly going to be applied to the skin or hair, you're going to be looking at this particular system as I have it represented. So there's a homeostasis mechanism in skin health, which the endocannabinoids play a role. They're constantly being synthesized and broken down by several different types skin cell types, including the hair follicles and some of the oil glands. And ultimately what that means is that research and mounting evidence has indicated that cannabinoids play a key role in skin health, and that they also, deficiencies and overproduction or overactivity of the system also likely contributes to several dysfunctions. Some of those include acne, dry skin, and inflammation. Those would be the top ones. So from a scientific perspective, as you look at claims and as you look at mechanism of actions and potential implications, there's a framework and approach that I believe groups should be taking. And one way to take that is to essentially look at what's the level of evidence? Has this been performed in a clinical study? Has this been performed in a small human population? Is it an animal study? Is it an in vitro or cell study? Or is it anecdotal? There's actually no studies, just people are promoting it and saying that it works. And then the level of data behind each of those. And so when you do that, you can come to some decisions as I've represented on the screen here. And just to orient you real quickly, at the bottom, you see a sliding scale for level of scientific evidence. So that's the approach that we took in putting this together for today. And you have strong scientific evidence where there's studies, there's clinical implications, and then you have weak scientific evidence where there's very limited studies or they're not in a relevant population, and there's really a lack of data. And so if we walk through this, CBD's ability to potentially regulate immune responses, which would relate to inflammation, is pretty well documented in a variety of different assay types, as well as in humans. So there's a strong likelihood that moving forward, additional research will be able to substantiate some of those claims. Next is itch. Itch is another big area where CBD is being used to help control itch, inflammation, and part of the pain response. So, there are some really good studies documenting that application of CBD inhibits some of the key pathways, and these are sensory nerve endings to help alleviate that. So that's been substantiated in several studies. And then as we move further on down, this is where there's some data, but there definitely needs to be more investigation. Antimicrobials. There's a recent publication that came out that very nicely showed that CBD has some really potent antimicrobial effects against a range of pathogenic bacteria, and can actually inactivate those bacteria in just a few hours through a cream. So it's an emerging space, but it's a unique opportunity. You think about CBD, one potentially from a skin cream, but also does it apply to cleaning products? Is there an effect there? Obviously, you would need to look at time course and duration of action in order to see if that was feasible. But nonetheless, it's an opportunity that, to the best of my knowledge, isn't currently being explored, at least in the public domain. Maybe it is privately. Then skin barrier. Skin barrier is another big area, specifically oil synthesis, which then kind of plays into acne. There's a lot of data that, at least in vitro models, so looking at cell systems, that CBD regulates oil productions and plays a key role in skin barrier health. And then you'll see claims out there that are focusing on hair maintenance, sweat and odor. And really, there's not a lot of data to substantiate or support those from our eyes and from what we see. There's one or two studies that are relatively strong, but overall there's just a lack of information to make any informed decision on how sweat and odor and hair maintenance would be strongly influenced by topical CBD application. If you look beyond CBD, which is where I do believe the market will go, CBD is very hot right now, but there are a number of other phytocannabinoids, CBG, CBN, CBC, that groups are looking at for both a consumer and clinical relevance. So overall, the cannabis plant has about 500 bioactives. Depending on the literature that you read, there's anywhere from 70 to 120 that have cannabinoid activity or would be classified as phytocannabinoids. Now, the issue has been that a lot of these molecules like CBG, CBN are in very low concentrations. And so being able to actually isolate those, get enough to do studies is a painstaking process, and it's a costly process. Nonetheless, there are other groups that have been successful in doing that, and they've showed that a number of these compounds have really good antibiotic properties. They may actually show some clinical relevance in treating things like analgesia, so reducing pain, inflammation, treatment of psoriasis, and then there's some interesting work going on in bone health and bone regrowth, because a number of the cannabinoid system plays a role there. What I'm seeing and what I'm noting is there are other opportunities to get to some of these compounds. So there are several groups that have filed patents to essentially use fermentation as a mechanism to produce many of these smaller bioactives. Now, from a product perspective, consumers are always seeking clean label and natural, and there's the debate of where does fermentation of compounds that you're going to use into a product fall into that space, and how do the consumers view that? So that's a business and a marketing area that would need further explored, so to speak. But when you bring this all together and you think about claims, you think about level of scientific evidence, the mechanism of action, in order to develop a product, it really comes down to understanding the things presented on the screen. Pharmacology is key there because it ties those together. But you also need to think about dosing. What's the dosing, and how do you get the desired effect? What's the delivery system, so the product format, and what's the safety profile of combining those ingredients, and the duration of use? Is it a short-term duration or is it a long-term duration? So I wanted to quickly just highlight that topical and transdermal products offer advantages as well as different advantages. And the reason that I put this slide on here is I've had a number of conversations, and there was some confusion around the difference between a topical and a transdermal product. And a lot of new players in the space that may not be familiar with medical applications and transdermal delivery systems, may potentially use some of those penetrating agents as a delivery mechanism for a topical, and that would completely change the safety risk and profile, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But just at a high level, a topical is not designed to enter systemic circulation. It's designed to work at the surface layer. It's going to be an oil, a cream, some type of gel. And then it's ideally situated for site-specific pain. Acne, inflammation, dermatitis, those are key, essentially areas that you would want to focus for topicals. Transdermal is a different delivery system. You're using chemical penetrating agents. Most of these are inactive ingredients that's going to allow the product to get into systemic circulation. And that's great if that's your objective, because one of the issues with ingested compounds is that cannabinoids, including CBD, undergo extensive first-pass metabolism. There are a number of strategies that can be employed to help mitigate that. But otherwise, if you're not doing that, then you're getting really incomplete experiences in terms of efficacy, as well as onset and duration of action. From a product development perspective, what jumps out at me here is if you're developing a topical, you're assuming that your agents are not going into systemic circulation. However, unless you've tested that in the right models, you could be exposing that patient or that particular consumer to levels of CBD and or THC that might have implications in terms of their general health, as well as drug testing and some other things that we'll touch on. So using cannabinoids as ingredients, probably many of you have looked at this and may be aware of it, but there are a lot of challenges that product developers face. From the onset, the physical properties. It's a highly lipophilic compound, has a log P of around 6, so its aqueous solubility is very low. It's highly viscous, similar to molasses. And most of these agents, unless you get a highly purified extract, typically don't have a desired aromatic profile. Maybe in certain situations you want to use that in your product to take advantage, but otherwise, that's something that needs to be masked or somehow compensated for in the delivery. There's processing implications because these compounds are highly susceptible to light, heat, and auto-oxidation, especially once they're in solution. You really need to take that into consideration. How are they being stored? How are they being processed? What's the amount of shear, heat, and light that's being applied? And what is the potential temperature of the system from a boiling standpoint? A lot of these, especially if you're doing high mixture shearing and you need to heat your product up, this is probably not as relevant in the kind of skincare and topical space. It might be more relevant in food when you're trying to kill pathogens. But if you're undergoing a heat treatment, then potentially you're going to be boiling off or inactivating, essentially degrading some of your compound. And then there's issues with blending and dispersants that are constantly needing to be revised and thought through in order to develop effective dosing strategy. And then just from a formulation, and a lot of these tie together, shelf life stability, as well as what other bioactives are in the product is critical, and really dosage control. So you want to be able to disperse these uniformly. There's a number of commercially available technologies and solutions that can help companies do that. Some of those technical unlocks, as I've listed here, including emulsification, nanoemulsions, co-solvency, encapsulation, that tend to provide enhanced delivery systems for these formulas. Okay, let's pause there. We've got about 15 minutes and I'll open it up to any questions that came through here.
Yeah, I had some great questions come through. So one was related to talking about some of the other cannabinoids beyond CBD. You touched on some of the other early indications of other cannabinoids that may have certain benefits. Can you say anything more about levels of research happening with those other cannabinoids today?
Yeah, level of research is low. There's a few publications that are out there, but there's not many, and they're not targeted towards specific diseases. Some of those are truly looking at the mechanism. I think there's one or two, without going into great detail, that might look at a potential model system just to see if there's efficacy. Now that's what you find in the public domain. What my guess is behind closed doors, at least from a medical standpoint, there's a lot more action going on behind the scenes than what you can see if you look at PubMed or you look at another scholar search engine. There's a lot to be done there.
Great. Next question. Are there any studies demonstrating the impact of topical CBD on endocannabinoids, or any studies showing any absorption of topical CBD at all?
That is an outstanding question, very thoughtful. To my acknowledgement, not with any of these product categories, and that would be a key study to look at, right? Because if the premise here is that endocannabinoid tone plays a role, then understanding how we're changing that tone by applying exogenous, potentially agonists or antagonists, or essentially molecules to the system, could influence the immediate area in the short term, but does that have implications in the long term? And the reason I say that is we have only recently learned about cannabinoid signaling in the GI tract and how that potentially relates to signaling in the brain that controls feeding behaviors. And so there could be a larger effect at play if you have chronic, potentially high use of some of these phytocannabinoids.
Super. And then one more. So CBD and THC are similar to endocannabinoids. Can you explain how CBD is similar to endocannabinoids, since the over 65 known targets for CBD tend to fall outside of CB1, CB2, et cetera?
Sorry there, I think I might have lost connection. Yeah, very good question. So the primary studies to date have mainly looked at CBD and THC and their ability to target CB1, CB2, the degrading enzymes that were mentioned, as well as the TRP channels and GPR 55 and 35. So that's where similarity exists, and there's a number of different avenues. So depending on the actual assay or the model system that you're looking at, CBD for the most part tends to block the CB1 receptor or actually reverse its activity. However, there are some studies that show that it activates it, and or it might have an influence on some of the enzymes that increase the levels of endogenous cannabinoids, which then have an effect. So what I'm saying here is it's complicated, and there's not a great answer to any one of those 65 targets.
All right, great. I think that covers the main themes of the questions that were coming through, so we can keep rolling.
Okay, great. So I wanted to wrap up with two slides, and this slide is speaking to the need for more studies around efficacy, safety, and quality control. It's absolutely essential that the industry adopt standards in terms of testing, traceability, the efficacy of the products, as well as the safety profile. So to date, CBD, when you just look at CBD and its potential ability to treat some of the ailments that were mentioned earlier, and some of the claims that groups are claiming that it has efficacy for, most of that data exists in vitro. So maybe it's an animal study, maybe it's some cell modeling. There are very limited actual human or clinical studies devoted to looking at CBD at a number of these treatment indications. And furthermore, the long-term effects haven't been investigated. So yes, there may be some short-term insight, but long-term effects have not been investigated. And really, that's one of the biggest sticking points with the FDA right now. Show me some more efficacy and show me long-term safety effects, and then we can work around quality control and some of the other issues along the supply chain. So if you look at the need for well-controlled human studies, those need to focus first and foremost on safety, and then pharmacokinetics of the topicals. What I noted in the next 3 bullets is that there are some real safety concerns. A lot of the safety to date has focused on ingested products. If you look, and many of you are probably familiar that GW Pharmaceuticals, a UK mid-sized pharmaceutical company who's been working in the cannabinoid space for a very long time, was successful in getting a drug approved, Epidiolex, to treat 2 rare forms of childhood epilepsy. And so that is a CBD derived drug, and there are potentially some very large doses that they're using for some of those patients, but it isn't an effective treatment, and no other treatments exist. Nonetheless, if you look at the clinical studies on the safety and pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamic profiles, what has emerged is that side effects included nausea, included rashes and itching, and one of the most notable ones was interaction of CBD with very specific enzymes in the liver. They're called cytochrome P450s. And those are responsible for metabolizing roughly 60% of drugs. So there's a real concern that if you're applying CBD and THC, is getting into systemic circulation and the body's liver is metabolizing that there could be some real-term consequences in terms of drug interactions, specifically on those that are taking pharmaceuticals, elderly populations and anyone else who may need it. Warfarin is a relatively common drug, and there are interactions with warfarin. So CBD has been shown to actually increase warfarin. And there's a number of other potential interactions here. When it comes to topicals, what's been demonstrated, at least in two different means, is that CBD likely accumulates in oil glands or the phylosebaceous area. So that would be hair and oil glands. There's a couple of different routes that it could accumulate in, but we don't know what the long-term effects are. And the reason that we have some data behind this is, one, individuals that smoke cannabis or consume a large amount of cannabis, you'll have high levels of THC, CBD, and other cannabinoids in these oil glands, hence the reason for hair follicle testing. In addition, we know that compounds such as steroids and other compounds that are highly lipophilic, so very similar in the lipophilicity of CBD and other phytocannabinoids, tend to reside and accumulate in those oil glands. And so, maybe there is no long-term consequence, or maybe there is. We just don't know to date. And I'll highlight, a study that my colleagues just put out a few days ago, where they looked at CBD labeling, they looked at CBD claims, and they really looked at the potential efficacy of CBD across a number of different areas. And what those studies, clearly demonstrated is, for the most part, there's a large mislabeling of products. The claims, the concentrations of actives in those products do not necessarily match what's promoted on the label. There's presence of contaminants. A number of other groups have shown that microbial contaminants, heavy metals are present in a lot of these extracts that product manufacturers are using, which speaks to my comment earlier that we really need stricter quality control and standardized practices and certificate of analysis across the value chain and across the supply chain, because we're really looking at these as a commodity and as a core ingredient to a number of different product applications. Furthermore, a lot of these CBD products that said they had no THC, the individuals tested positive. And so that kind of gets back to my transdermal and topical comment earlier, is you have a liability to consumers and a responsibility to consumers that if you're claiming that there's no THC, you better make sure that there's no THC in there. You could fail drug tests, and there's a lot of other implications that could potentially happen. So there's more work and due diligence and responsibility that needs to be taken in that area. And then I've already commented on kind of the potential for liver damage and interaction with certain metabolizing enzymes. Final note is there's some really new research, and I say really new, like it just recently came out, and it's one of two studies that I'm currently aware of that shows ingestion of CBD, not topical application, but ingestion of CBD does have a pretty significant effect on inhibiting components of the male reproductive system. Now, there were samples taken from humans that showed lower sperm count and potentially lower quality of sperm. And then the majority of the work was actually done in cellular or in animal models that recapitulate a number of reproductive diseases. And chronic and acute exposure of CBD displayed concerning issues with male reproductive health. So with that, I'd like to just move on to our last slide and save just a couple of minutes for Q&A. Our goal here is to help you navigate the complexities, and hopefully today we've given you some useful information on consumer and market opportunities, but really around the science and the technologies and approaches from a CPG and a materials perspective. So within this space, we've spent time working on strategy with clients, so helping them think about patenting, acquiring, where are the white space opportunities, who's out there doing what, how are they doing it, and where's your value proposition, and where might you enter the market. A lot of that ties to the risk and opportunity. Some groups are more risk averse, so we look at all of that and we tie that together. We've helped groups walk through regulations. How do they influence your development, potential claims, as well as transportation? If you manufacture it here, how do you get it to X, Y, and Z? In addition to that, and what you saw for the most part today was a lot of our insights work. And that really hits around feasibility, what do consumers desire, the viability, and kind of the technical approaches to that. So what are the claims, and is there science behind the claims? We showed you an approach to essentially evaluate that. What are the long and short-term medicinal as well as physical effects of cannabinoids? And then where are the problems to be solved, and who's really solving them in genomics, formulation, and health? And then finally, we're always here to assist and walk through go-to-market strategies. This in theory ties to health and wellness and other product categories, and what are consumers really seeking. So how do you identify, how do you vet, and how do you really select the right partners that enable differentiation of yourself from the competition? And so we analyze the supply chain, and you saw some earlier work of that, and we really look for unique opportunities to help you get you where you need. So with that, I will wrap up and hand it over to Jeff to feed me any Q&A that has come through.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Lawrence. No new questions have come through, but let's keep. Well, no, here comes one right now. Would you say the research on adverse effects on male reproductive health is significant or conclusive enough to say men should avoid CBD consumption, especially if they have no medical conditions?
At this point in time, I would say no. As I mentioned, it's one of two studies that I'm aware of, but it does raise a flag for sure. And that's because the quality of the research and the relevance, so it wasn't this, we know this signaling system causes X, and CBD works on that, so it will potentially do that. These were more tangible, relevant experiments. So I would not, yes, I'll leave it at that.
Great. I think that's it for the Q&A.
Okay. Well, I appreciate everyone's time today. Jeff and I are always available to answer any questions. So our contact information is up. You can also find us through the Innovation Advisor website. If you have any additional questions, please reach out. I'd be happy to discuss those with you and think about other opportunities.